As the giant tentacles began to seize the boat, Tom thought quickly and grabbed a tomahawk. This is a true story, documented in newspapers and scientific journals, about a sea monster encounter off the coast of Newfoundland and a 12-year-old boy who survived it. It happened in October 1873 near Belle Island, beside a working fishing village called Portugal Cove. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand where Tom lived. Step off a small boat into a Newfoundland harbor in autumn of 1873, and you arrive in a fishing village built around cod. Salt hangs in the air with wood smoke and tar. Fish dry on raised flakes behind low stages set over the water. Boats lie against narrow wharves, pulled clear of the tide between trips. Sea wolves are born and raised here. Their wilderness is the Atlantic Ocean. A boy like Tom would grow up among hooks, nets, paddles, and small boats tied along the shoreline. He knows the harbor well. The sea stands at the center of the village and at the center of his life. In the late 19th century, Portugal Cove was a small fishing settlement on the western side of Conception Bay, tied to St. John's and to the Atlantic cod trade. Houses stood along the slope above the harbor, wooden frame structures, some whitewashed, others weathered gray, with sheds attached and root cellars cut into the hill. The shoreline formed the working center of the village. Narrow wharves stood on wooden piles, each leading to a stage where cod were headed, split, and salted. Behind the stages rose flakes, built on poles for drying fish in the open air. Paths ran between and beneath these structures. The inshore cod fishery structured daily life. Men and boys fished from punts and skiffs using hand lines and returned their catch to be processed immediately on the stages. Women, older girls, and younger boys handled much of the curing work, laying fish on flakes, turning them through the day, and covering them when fog or drizzle threatened the drying. Work began before daylight and continued until the catch was secured and the gear prepared for the next tide. Boys often entered the boat in minor roles at 8 or 10, and by 12, many were regular crew on punts or small schooners. A 12-year-old like Tom rowed, baited hooks, hauled fish, carried salt, fetched water, and assisted wherever labor was required. When not fishing, they chopped wood, tended livestock, worked in gardens, and ran errands to the merchant. Since 1866, the transatlantic telegraph cable had come ashore at Heart's Content, linking Newfoundland directly to Europe. Messages crossed the Atlantic in minutes. St. John's functioned as the colony's export and administrative center, where cod and oil were shipped abroad. Steamships operated regular North Atlantic routes, connecting Atlantic ports with Britain and the United States. This was why, when a boy brought a severed tentacle to town, the story could race across the Atlantic in days. An October day during the fishing season began before daylight. Tom would be awake around 3 to 4 a.m., eat quickly, bread with molasses, sometimes tea, and carry bait and gear down to the punt or skiff. The boat was pushed off and rowed to the inshore grounds before sunrise. Fishing was done by hand line over the gunwale. Hooks were baited and dropped repeatedly. Cod were jerked in and hauled over the side. Some fish might be gutted at once, others left for the stage. The boat had to be bailed constantly. By midday, the crew returned with the catch and unloaded it into tubs or hand barrows. At the stage, the fish were passed up to be split, the planked floor washed down, and the catch salted in layers. Through the afternoon, split cod were carried to the flakes, laid out in rows, and later turned to dry evenly. Meals were brief and taken near the work. If weather threatened, fish were covered. In the evening, gear was mended, hooks baited for the next tide, wood cut, water fetched, and other household tasks completed. Conception Bay in autumn offered workable but changeable conditions. The bay extended roughly 50 miles inland and did not freeze in winter, though field ice could drift through. Fog was frequent along the northwest shore, and easterly winds could drive currents along the coast. On calm days, the water lay flat. On others, sudden squalls or breaking seas posed risk to small boats. Capsize, gear accidents, and disorientation in fog were constant hazards. Fishermen often could not swim, and heavy clothing reduced survival time in cold water. Marine life included cod, capelin, herring, squid, seals, and whales. Capelin runs drew entire communities to the shore for bait and food. Between the early 1870s and early 1880s, numerous giant squid were reported in Newfoundland waters, including entanglements with small fishing boats in bays such as Conception Bay. On October 25th, sometimes recorded as the 26th, 1873, they left Portugal Cove in the usual way, early in the morning, while it was still dim over the bay. The tide was fair and there was only a small swell on. The punt slid off from the stones and Theophilus Picot took the oars. Daniel Squires came in over the side and settled on the thwart. Tom, 12 years old, Theophilus's son, sat between them with the gear at his feet. They were heading out to check their herring nets in the Tickle between Portugal Cove and Bell Island. This was routine work. Theophilus watched the lay of the water and the faint line of their net marks ahead. Daniel spoke a few words about the weather and the catch the day before. Tom kept his hands clear and his weight steady, the way he had been taught, his eyes on the water. Partway out, Tom pointed ahead. There. Off the bow, do you see it? There was something on the surface, a dark heap a little off to starboard. At first it could have been a bit of wreck, a torn sail, or a mass of weed. It sat low in the water, not moving with any clear shape, just a dark, sodden lump with lighter streaks showing when the small swell rolled under it. They pulled a few strokes closer. Theophilus eased the boat so they came up slowly, not ramming it. Tom squinted at it. Up close, it did not look like timber. It did not have the hard lines of a barrel or plank. It looked soft, like wet flesh, and there were pale strands drifting from it under the surface. They were close enough now to reach it. Tom stood feet apart on the thwart and took the nearest oar. The punt shifted under his weight, but held steady. He leaned out and smacked the dark mass with the oar, the way one might test a dead seal or a piece of wreck. The mass started to move. The heap under the oar did not merely roll, it heaved. The surface broke and spread outward like something opening. For a second, Tom saw a pale underside, a curve of flesh, and then an eye, large and round, turned straight toward the boat. There was no time to think what it might be. The boat lurched as something struck it from below. A heavy blow right under the bottom boards, as though a rock had risen up from deep water and struck them. The punt shuddered. Daniel caught the gunwale to keep from going over. Then the gigantic tentacles came forth from the water. Two huge, pale limbs shot up out of the water and fell over the sides of the boat, one forward, one aft. Each was thick as a man's leg where it crossed the gunwale. The skin was cold and slick. Along the underside, rows of suckers fastened onto the wood with a hard, wet pull. The boat began to go down on that side at once. Water slopped over the gunwale and rushed into the bilge. Tom felt the boards tilt under his boots. "Lord help us," Daniel muttered, throwing his weight to the far side. Theophilus dropped the oars and seized at one of the arms, trying to wrench it from the timber. His hands slid on the wet flesh. The suckers held fast. The arm tightened and the boat sank lower. Another blow from beneath rocked them again, the beak striking up at the bottom boards. There was no space for further speech. The thing in the water was hauling the punt under. Tom could hear the rush of water into the bilge and the sharp creak of the wood under strain. Down in the bottom, near Tom's feet, was the tomahawk. As the giant tentacles seized the boat, Tom grabbed the tomahawk and turned toward the sea monster. He brought the blade down, driving it deep into the tentacle. The arm on his side lay across the gunnel, thick and solid, the suckers gripping the board. Tom stepped toward it, braced himself, and struck. The tomahawk bit into the flesh. It yielded more than wood, but resisted more than fish, a heavy, rubbery substance. Dark fluid and water splashed up. The arm jerked, but did not release. Tom struck again and again, cutting into the same place while the boat shifted beneath him. The suckers strained and tightened. The wood creaked. Water continued to slosh in around his boots. At length, the blade cut through. The severed portion flopped and slid away, the outer length whipping back into the water. The men tried to heave the second arm upward, but it would not give. The tentacle still held fast, dragging the boat down. Tom stood resolute, like a young Norse warrior at the moment of combat, the tomahawk firm in his hand. He crossed the narrow boards and brought it down upon the second arm where it lay across the gunnel. The flesh was thick and the suckers clung hard to the wood. He struck again in the same place and again, cutting deeper with each blow while the boat shifted under him. At last the steel went through. The arm split and tore free, the severed length slipping back into the water as the pull upon the punt suddenly ceased. The boat rose, though she still sat low with the water they had shipped. Out beyond the punt, the creature was moving away. They saw a long, pale shape just below the surface, rolling away from them, and a pointed tail lifted clear of the water as it went backward in the manner of squids. The water behind it darkened as it discharged a heavy cloud of black ink, spreading wide over the surface. Tom stood breathing hard, the tomahawk still in his hand. "What in God's name was that creature?" Daniel said at last. "A devilfish," said Theophilus. Floating not far off were pieces of pale flesh and the two severed arms, drifting back in the swell. The nearest long piece lay half submerged, its suckers still visible along its length. They bailed first. Tom took the bucket and worked until the punt rode higher. Then they hauled the severed tentacle over the gunnel inch by inch. It was heavy and unwieldy, the limp weight of something that had been alive only moments before. Tom's hands slipped on the slick skin, but he held fast and dragged. They laid the arm down the center of the boat. It stretched nearly the full length of the 20-foot punt, the suckers pale and round along its underside. No one spoke of setting more gear. Theophilus took the oars and turned the punt back toward Portugal Cove. Tom sat beside the severed limb, the tomahawk resting on the boards between his legs. Behind them, the black stain of ink spread across the bay, and the monster that had seized their boat was gone. The story of the devilfish did not end when it slipped backward into black water. It continued on land. The day after the attack, Tom Picot took the severed arm to a village priest, who sent him on to Reverend Moses Harvey in St. John's. At Harvey's door, the boy offered what he called the horn of a big squid, laid out his story without much fuss, and asked if the minister wanted to buy it. Harvey later remembered how eagerly he closed the bargain, writing that he suddenly found himself the owner of one of the rarest curiosities in the animal kingdom, the arm of the hitherto mythical devilfish, a piece of a creature that naturalists and sailors had argued about for generations. Government geologist Alexander Murray joined Harvey soon after the arm arrived. Together, they laid it out and took careful measurements, working before rot and shrinkage could change it. From the cut end to the very tip, they found it ran about 17 feet. The last 2.5 feet narrowed into a flattened paddle, while the inner 14.5 formed a rounded, muscular shaft 3 to 4 inches thick, about the size of a man's wrist. Along the club at the far end, 2 neat rows of 12 great suckers stood out, smooth and toothless, each more than an inch across. Around these, in clusters, were smaller, toothed suckers, some no bigger than a pinhead. This was no half-digested scrap found in a whale's stomach. It was fresh, largely intact, and detailed enough to serve as anatomical proof. Harvey preserved the arm in alcohol and placed it in a St. John's museum. Whether it still exists, misfiled in some cabinet, or rotted away long ago is unclear. Newfoundland suffered fires often, and museums, paper, and specimens were sometimes lost. Weeks later, fishermen at Logie Bay hauled in nearly an entire squid. He gave them $10, serious money in 1873 Newfoundland, and received a carcass with a 7-foot mantle, a 5-foot girth, arms around 6 feet long, tentacles reaching 24, and eyes the size of saucers. Harvey did something both absurd and historic. He dumped the squid over his sponge bath, a 38-inch wash basin, and hired 2 men to carry it through St. John's streets to a photography studio. On December 2nd, 1873, Simeon Parsons and Sherburne McKinney made 2 plates, arms and head hanging over the tub, mantle stretched across the studio floor. Those photographs exploded across the Atlantic in 1874, the first images of a giant squid. By the time the tissue reached Yale University, much of it had already shrunk and dried. The animal was little more than gelatin. Harvey, a minister armed with a bottle of alcohol rather than the skill of a trained taxidermist, did what he could to preserve it. Still, enough remained for zoologist Addison Emery Verrill to measure, sketch, and describe the specimen. He stripped away the exaggerations, separating the body from the arms to reduce the supposed 60-foot monster to more modest proportions, and formally placed the creature into scientific taxonomy. Architeuthis Harvey, he called one specimen. Later folded into Architeuthis ducks. The name shifted, the animal did not. Through the 1870s, Newfoundland became the epicenter of what historians now call the Decade of Architeuthis. Between 1870 and 1881, dozens of giant squid were caught or washed ashore. Yale ended up with pieces from 6 specimens. In 1877, a nearly intact squid at Catalina sold for $500, 50 times what Tom's Tentacle brought. At Glover's Harbor, a hacked-up giant entered record books with inflated numbers that still circulate. By 1881, the transformation was complete. What had been devilfish and sea monster was now specimen, plate, measurement, Latin name. The chain began with a boy swinging an axe. The squid left a mark on zoology. It almost certainly left a mark on Tom Picot as well. But his trail goes cold after the brief media craze. In scientific papers, he appears only as the lad who severed the tentacle. Alexander Murray names the older fisherman, Theophilus Picot. The boy remains in the background. Searching for him in the records yielded no results. Newfoundland did not begin systematic civil registration until 1891. Earlier lives depended on church books, and St. John's suffered repeated destructive fires between 1816 and 1906. A working fishing family left little beyond baptism entries and census tallies. Even the surname fractures. Picot appears under multiple spellings in surviving records, producing several possible Thomases. None can be securely tied to the 12-year-old in the boat. Tom may now lie under a stone in Conception Bay, bearing a name other than Tom Picot. Or he may have joined the stream of Newfoundlanders who left for mainland mills and American fisheries, his name drifting into Canadian or U.S. archives detached from the Squid story forever. One of the most cited animal encounters of the 19th century rests on the swing of his axe. Tom's life dissolves into clerical gaps, leaving some of the mystery behind for us to imagine what became of him. The attack traveled along two channels, newspapers and science. Within days, regional papers carried headlines about a devilfish off Newfoundland. One version called it a green-eyed monster. The image held steady across retellings, a dark mass mistaken for wreckage, a boathook strike, tentacles over the gunnel, desperate chopping. Moses Harvey wrote aggressively for publication. He fed editors narrative drama and zoological detail. The story spread. Then came Alexander Murray's letter, dated November 10, 1873, published in the American Naturalist in 1874. He wrote plainly, "On or about the 25th of October, Picot pushed his boat alongside. The creature's fury seemed to be aroused. It struck at the bottom of the boat with its beak and threw its monstrous tentacles over the boat, which probably it might have dragged to the bottom had not Picot severed one or more of the tentacles with his axe." Murray recorded the claimed 60-foot length, the 5-foot diameter, the inky retreat. He also recorded the measurements of the severed arm. Once printed in a scientific journal, the encounter could not be dismissed as dockside talk. Verrill at Yale treated it as data. He corrected exaggerations but accepted the anatomy. The devilfish entered formal zoology. Later writers would recycle the drama, green-eyed monster, devilfish, but lean on Verrill's drawings and Murray's letter for authority. Newspapers made it spectacle, Harvey made it specimen, Murray made it record, Verrill made it taxonomy. A violent afternoon off Bell Island became the foundation stone of the modern giant squid. In October 1873, a boy swung an axe at something rising out of black water. Men called it devilfish. Scientists called it Architeuthis ducks. We name what rises to the surface. The depths themselves remain unknown.